Yes, we do hear you. Do you hear us?
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of GreenWeek and to this particular parallel session in which we explore environmental sustainability and equality and ask the question, dilemma or opportunity? Or perhaps dilemma and or opportunity? My name is Katrina Sickle. I'm a moderator and broadcaster, and I have the immense privilege of guiding us all through the next 60 minutes, accompanied by a handful of very eloquent speakers. Some of them are in this studio in Brussels with me, and some of them are joining online. Please let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that in this session we have interpretation in French and in English. So very briefly, what is the starting point? Well, pollution might not discriminate, but its impact absolutely does. And in the context of the European Green Deal, there's a lot of talk about the just transition. It's really grabbing the headlines. So how can we make sure that improvements in people's lives and in people's well-being are fairly sustained in an era of environmental and climate instability? And how can we ensure that we have more inclusive and environmentally sustainable solutions that really are to the benefit of all? And finally, how can we ensure access for all? And when I mean access to natural resources, to healthy environments, to the distribution of food, of course to technology, and so much more. And you will hear more about that in the specifics from our opening speaker. Now, as I said, I have 4 guests who will join me for a panel discussion, and those discussions will be topped and tailed by 2 delightful speakers from the European Commission. So please stay tuned right until the end. So let me welcome you. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to all of you with me. And of course, welcome to everybody that is joining us online. So I will introduce everybody who you are seeing on your screens in the studio. There you now see those of us who are joining online in just a moment. I will invite you to put the shortest of short questions into Slido, but please bear with us. I will only take 1-star question if I can manage to create that space in this session. You can tweet at any time, #EU GreenWeek 2021. That's enough from me. I'm going to turn to you, please. I have with me the Deputy Director General of DG Environment. Her name is Joanna Drake, and I'm going to ask you, Joanna, if you can please kick things off and frame our discussions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I wonder that a lot of you probably are asking, what's the point about social justice and the environment? How do they interact? Where do they meet? And I think if we think about the context that we're all living in, we've been living in for the last 18 months or so with COVID, I think this has been brought to the fore for us to actually understand and make tangible. Only this morning, I was listening to the news, and the big news was about, how many people, in fact, in the world still do not and will not have access to the COVID vaccine, the anti-COVID vaccine rather. So there you have it, that in the end, when we are all talking about our health, and we're talking about pollution this week, aren't we? Health and pollution, this is the consciousness that we're all living. We want to breathe clean air, and we're thinking of it as a right. So these people are thinking about how to protect their health like we all are, but at the end of the day, they do not have access to that vaccine. This is what it is all about today. As you said very rightly at the beginning, Katrina, pollution will not discriminate. We will all breathe bad air if the air is bad, but the impact of it is not equal. And this is something that I think from the beginning of COVID we have discussed. At the end of the day, we're all living the same lockdowns, but the impact is different. So what are we going to discuss today? I think the relevance of today's topic is about ensuring that when you are a man, a woman, a child, a poor person, a person with disability, you're not or somebody who does not have access to the basic needs of life, you're not going to be impacted more. And at the same time, as a human being, you still have responsibilities towards not making it worse for the planet, for the environment, for our immediate ambience. So we all carry the responsibility, but at the end of the day, it does not allow us to have actual equal access of opportunity to respect the environment, to still improve our lives. We talk about the green economy. Do these people really have the opportunity to have access to providing solutions through the green economy, for instance? Will they be more susceptible to have to migrate because of climate degradation, for instance, or because of bad air? And I think this is what the subject is today. And one further point. Maybe many of you are thinking, yes, this is only being discussed because it's a trendy topic, because COVID has brought it to the fore, we are living it more, we are touching it more, this inequality. But at the end of the day, I think if anything, it's going to be really growing exponentially as we speak. Yeah. Why? Because we have a younger generation today who is more and more, not only used to, but I would say expecting that there is a priori and all inequalities are wiped out and there's more equality. At the same time that there is climate instability and environmental instability. So I think, what we will have to discuss today is in what ways are we not going to be just doing a very, soft gesture and tokenism. We have to go beyond that. We have to go beyond that and make it real also for the people who are suffering from inequalities, at the same time that there is this environmental degradation and climate instability going on.
Thank you so much, not least for giving that obviously very pertinent example of COVID, which helps to frame these discussions in terms of what do we actually mean. But what I picked up there was what you said also about those who are in more precarious situations. You gave some examples, also having agency to have solutions to the... It's not just the question of what we might always say beneficiaries, it's about actually being able to take action themselves. And I think that's an important point, and thank you for raising it, that we need to keep in mind in our very whistle-stop tour of the subject this morning. I thank you. I know you have an awful lot on. You have framed this beautifully. I am going to give you the opportunity to get on with your day, and I'm going to jump on these fabulous speakers that I have to talk about and unpack some of those issues that you have touched upon. Thank you so much, Joanna Drake.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So, Joanna Drake there and her colleague from the European Commission, a lovely lady called Elizabeth Werner. She is Deputy Secretary General of Policy Coordination, but she is the head of the Equality Task Force of the Commission. There, we have you here. You've made it. You managed to jump out of something and jump online. I'm going to give you the opportunity to listen behind the scenes because I rely upon you to come back at the end of our discussions. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A and pull out some of the main features and the topics on the table. So thank you to you. Thank you very much also to Joanna Drake. So let's see who we have with us for these questions that I'm going to put to these brilliant speakers on the panel. With me in the studio, I have Patricia Heidegger. Patricia Heidegger you are Director for Global Policies and Sustainability at, of course, the EEB, the European Environmental Bureau. Now, let me just explain for all of you at home that Patricia has been advocating for global environmental justice, human rights and sustainable development for more than 20 years. She is extremely well qualified to be with us today, and at the EEB she leads on the implementation of the SDGs in and by the EU on environmental democracy, on a just transition and many other topics. And just to add, she has co-authored a report quite recently on environmental racism against Roma communities in Europe. So a very, very warm welcome to you. Opposite you, far on the other side, hello, we have from the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, we have Michael O'Flaherty. So lovely to have you here. Thank you very much. Michael is a former Professor of Human Rights at the Universities of Nottingham and the National University of Ireland, but for 8 years he was also a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, latterly as Vice Chair, so he has an awful lot of experience, not just at their headquarters, but also in the field. So a really critical person to have on our panel this morning. who do we have joining us online? We have two fabulous people. Carleen Scheel, there we are. Hello to you, Director of the European Institute for Gender Equality in Vilnius, Lithuania. This is, for those of you at home who don't know, the only EU agency that focuses exclusively on gender equality, and it provides very reliable, very policy-oriented research to support both the EU and its member states in strengthening the promotion of gender equality. So we'll hear more about that and some of the very valuable data and case studies. Carleen will bring those to the fore. And finally online, very, very important, not just to hear from civil society and the public sector, but from a representative. There we are, Matthias. I'm being very careful. A representative of the private sector. We have Matthias Berninger. He is Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Sustainability at Bayer. This is a life science company. I think you should all know this, got a very long history and a very strong focus in healthcare and agriculture. And Matthias is responsible for the company's global affairs practice, global public affairs practice, and also for making Bayer's approach to sustainability a key pillar of its business strategy. And in a previous life, he was a member of the German Federal Parliament representing the Green Party. So 4 fabulous people to help us unpack the topic. Now, I have pretty much terrified these good people into speaking in an incredibly concise way so we can fit in as much as possible. Now, as you all know, I've got 3 questions for each of you for your concise answers, and I'm just going to get stuck in now. And I'm going to start with Carleen, if we might have you back. Carleen from the European Institute for Gender Equality. Now, you've said, even you've said before this session, that gender isn't a side issue, it's always relevant. I'm being a little bit the devil's advocate here and saying, well, you know, in the EU, women are seemingly everywhere. So underline for us why it is so important to address this gender equality environment dynamic in a very concise way. Thank you, Carleen.
Well, thank you, Katrina, and good morning to you all. I hope that you can hear me well. Good. And thanks for reminding me of my statements that gender is never a side issue and always relevant, because that's exactly the point I would like to reiterate today. Women and men are impacted differently by climate change, but they also impact climate change in a different way. Yeah. And let me give you 2 examples. For example, the carbon footprint. We know from research that men more frequently use cars, for example, than women. Women use public transport more frequently. And if we look, for example, at recycling, because women still do most of the housework in every single EU country, this activity falls heavily on their shoulders. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying here is that it's really important that policymakers take this reality into account when designing their policy, mm-hmm. but also in, let's say, communication campaigns, the communication towards citizens. Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned the representation of women. It is true. We see women in leadership roles. In this case, I think it's very important that women are at the table, mm-hmm. where the decisions are made that affect their lives. It's very important that they're involved in these discussions and that their needs are taken into account. And that's why they should be there. That's why they should be there. And it is true that we have many women leading when it comes to climate change policies in the European Union. Let me give a few examples.
Okay, you're going to need to be super brief, but go for it.
Yes.
Just pick a couple. Thank you.
In the European Commission, women hold almost 60% of top political positions related to climate policy. In the European Parliament, women make up some 40% of members of environment-related committees. But the picture is less rosy at national level, mm-hmm. where ministers hardly are in charge of these portfolios, and the same for the parliamentary committees. And this is really a problem.
Okay.
And we know that companies with more women on their boards do less harm to the environment Countries that are more gender equal have a smaller carbon footprint. So yes, it is important to take the gender issue into account when we talk about the environment.
Okay.
And that's what I would like to stop.
Thank you, and also thank you for elucidating there right at the start with some concrete examples, things that we might take for granted, you know, when we talked about cars, when we also, just to say women, in terms of where the weight of responsibility lies, and also for articulating very clearly how they are not actually represented in the ways we might think. So I will come back to you, Carleen. I'm going to turn to Patrizia, if I may. Now, I'm quoting people here. I started with a quote for Carleen there. You've commented yourself when we talk about the European Green Deal, it's gender blind. So if we really want to honour this gender just European Green Deal, give me 3 recommendations. Why is it so important, but the 3 recommendations to do so?
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. Indeed, I mean, we were very astonished to see that the European Green Deal communication doesn't mention gender at all. And also now when we look into all the different strategies and laws that are being developed, whether that's the Circular Economy Action Plan or the Climate Law or the Farm to Fork Strategy, just to name 3, there's basically no underlying gender analysis. And we've heard the examples why this is so important, whether that's the gendered impact of chemicals that's different on men and women, because due to gender stereotypes, for instance, women are more exposed to chemicals in cleaning agents or in cosmetics. There are certain risks related to pregnancies, but the Sustainable Chemical Strategy only deploys the fact that we know too little about the gendered impact of chemicals, but it doesn't offer any solutions. And we've also just heard from the Institute that there's a big difference in mobility patterns between men and women, and that men and women move differently. So now if we focus our policies, for instance, one-sidedly on promoting e-mobility, electric cars, that will benefit those people who have privileged access to cars, which means men and men from higher income groups, and those men and women relying on public, safe, accessible, low-cost transport will not benefit equally from these policies.
So give me 3 actions in 3 sentences that we should look at. Well, of course,
there's a lot of actions needed because all these
policies... And don't speed up, just to say, because our lovely interpreters will have my guts for garters at the end of this. Take a breath, you're a faster speaker than me. Go ahead, sorry to interrupt.
I will just have one recommendation, because I mean, the recommendations for each and every policy, and that would go into too much detail. But I think we need to acknowledge that maybe in the best case, an environmental policy that is gender blind perpetuates inequalities, and in the worst case, it actually widens the gap that we already have. So the one recommendation that I have is that we really need gender mainstreaming throughout all the policies that we are now developing to move towards sustainability. And that's not really a new approach. What we need is a transversal, cross-cutting, a holistic approach to policy making, which we've already committed to with the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. The EU is committed to the SDGs on paper, but in the way we actually design our policies, that has not yet been put in practice, and we need to adapt our governance for that.
Thank you. Thank you for your clarity, and sorry that I cut you short, just so I can let everybody lay out their stalls. So let me turn to Michael there. You know, in theory, and we know this is a union of equality, Patrizia there saying, but hang on, European Green Deal, brilliant, but oof, I'm not seeing what we're talking about there. Very important too, because for some of these groups that Joanna mentioned, people, we're not all a big lump, they can experience this twice over, 3 times over, be penalised. We use a term that not a lot of people know, environmental racism. How would you describe it? How do we get behind that term?
Well, we get behind the term by putting faces on the reality. We've just had a great few points made on the issue of gender. Going beyond that, I think, for example, of the situation of people already marginalised, vulnerable on the edges of our society. They are being impacted harder than anybody else with environmental degradation and pollution. You mentioned yourself at the beginning the Roma. I stay awake at night thinking of the situation of Roma, living in deplorable conditions, not their own fault, but pushed to the margins of our societies, living near landfill, in some cases living literally on dumps. I think of the migrants that I visited in reception facilities on Mediterranean islands in deeply environmentally degraded conditions where life is impossible. I think of indigenous peoples who've had their land taken away from them by environmental interventions, such as the Sami, who've lost their reindeer farming possibilities for this reason. And there are so many other groups. And then you have to go beyond the groups and look at the experience of different people within these groups.
Yes.
I don't like jargon, but the jargon word is intersectionality. Gender is a very important...
I'll say that again, because they're interpreting. You can also slow down. Intersectionality,
Okay,
no
but you won't hear it again from me.
No, that's fine.
The gender issue. Women will typically experience these situations worse than men. Children. What's it like at the moment to be a Roma child? You've got all the impact of COVID, and you've got the fact that you're living in some filthy location because there isn't the investment by society in helping you integrate in society. People with disabilities, and on the list goes. And let me just wrap up by saying it's the same people that are on the edges for other aspects of life.
Yes.
We have a really unequal society here in Europe. We have to fix the big inequalities, and within that then address specific issues of the environment. I'll come back to that later.
Okay, thank you. And again, I thank you because I think what is obviously very important, and I know when I was talking to the Commission about this particular session, we were saying, you know, there is so much about women, men. We've got the Me Too. We've got all sorts of things going on. There's so much Black Lives Matter. And sometimes we want to, number one in this session, give very broad examples of what we're talking about in terms of vulnerable people in vulnerable and precarious situations. It's extremely broad. That's number one. So make sure this isn't just about women, men, gender balance. And then number two, it's also getting people to really care as well. So those examples you gave, I think, are absolutely critical there. Let me turn, if I may, to Matthias online and start with what might be a little bit of an obvious one for everybody. We've got public actors. We know they have a responsibility in fostering equality in the broadest sense. We heard there, even at EU level, there is the theory, there is certainly that commitment to values, equality, but hang on a minute, there's some gaps in the policy. How do players within industry make sure they incorporate inclusivity, diversity in their internal strategies, not just as add-ons, not just as frills?
First of all, thank you for having me, and let me start with a simple business figure. So at Bayer, we spend 23 billion every year with our suppliers, and those are 80,000 suppliers around the world. So with every euro we are spending, we have an immediate impact one way or the other on people and on communities. And the big question, I think, when you look at business is one around the beautiful word of key performance indicators. You hear a lot of great things from businesses, but my recommendation is look at their key performance indicators. So let's talk about gender equality. Is there a very clear target to achieve gender equality on all levels of leadership? Is there a very clear target, for example, on social sustainability topics, or are businesses more focused on environmental topics? And last but not least, are those targets independently audited, like it's totally common for financials? This is what I would always recommend to look at. In the case of Bayer, we have set us these targets, and we also connected them to remuneration. Because I believe you, especially for men, you can't make a man to believe in one thing if he's paid for the opposite.
So you say you talk remuneration, did you say there?
Remuneration is a big factor here. But generally speaking, business leadership teams are really good in managing conflicting KPIs.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, they need to have KPIs in the space of sustainability. And in sustainability, they need to balance social and environmental topics to really hit the mark.
Indeed. And as I recall, and we might hear a little bit from that in a minute, you said, Katrina, it's tougher than you think for some businesses. They don't really have the right indicators, the strategic thinking, particularly in that area. Let me turn again, just to keep this as balanced as possible, Patrizia. asked Michael there, listen, can you unpack a little bit what environmental racism means? This is his long underappreciated in the EU. He talked about the Roma. You have co-authored recently this big approach. Again, talking concrete action. What do you think the EU could be doing to particularly address anti-Roma discrimination? We had some really compelling examples from Michael there.
Yeah, I think that the first step is really to acknowledge that something like environmental racism exists. I think a lot of people still struggle to understand what it actually means. I mean, we've heard from Michael that really a lot of Roma communities live and work in these very poor environments. They are excluded from environmental services, very basic environmental services, like, you know, having tap water at your home, having the garbage collected in front of your house, or just have access to green spaces. So this just transition starts with very basic challenges, even in our rich Europe, where we are still struggling to provide drinking water to people's homes. And then the next thing is that these communities are often more exposed to pollution and contamination. And we've heard that they often live next to landfills. They often also live on contaminated former industrial sites, or just right next to the highway or a polluting industry. And that has very devastating health impacts as well. And we know very little about these health impacts. And then on top of that, what we've also seen is that Roma communities often fall victims to evictions. So whenever the area where they live becomes more interesting for the rest of society, whether that's because we want to build a road or a nice new housing project, even tourism facilities, or sometimes even for environmental protection, these communities get literally pushed away to live in the wastelands, the lands that we as the majority of society don't want.
So talk actions.
Yes. So we need to kind of frame this as environmental racism and see how this environmental discrimination is linked to the fact that this exclusion is rooted in racist stereotypes of people that we as a society frame as gypsies and that we push aside. So that's the first step, to acknowledge that. And then what we welcome is to see that the new Roma strategic framework has now introduced the concept of environmental justice. So that's a step forward. Now we need to kind of apply this concept at national level, where the member states have to develop new action plans of how they want to increase the inclusion of Roma communities. And when they, for instance, consider the question of segregated houses, they now should look at this also with that environmental perspective and how these two things intersect. And we hope that this concept of environmental justice will be deployed to all other European policies alike, to make sure that all social policies and environmental policies are much more integrated.
Thank you very much, and thank you for underlining and giving that example. And obviously there what we heard is that, first of all, and categorically, and Patrizia gave again some very good examples, the awareness, without making that link, how does action get taken? And the action now needs to be taken within a much more complex framework. Let me thank you. Carleen is there. Keep her there, please. We just saw Carleen, who is in Lithuania. Let me come back to you, the European Institute for Gender Equality. We've heard some examples there. What do we mean when we talk environmental racism? Who are the kinds of people? All sorts of people. This isn't one lump of people, you know, we're all sorts of groups, and within them all sorts of people who are in more precarious situations, more vulnerable. So what is that relationship between gender and other social characteristics when we're looking at fighting environmental degradation and climate change? Just give us 2 or 3 points so we understand clearly how that all fits together.
Yes, thank you, Katrina. And actually, here we are talking about intersectionality. It's a difficult word, but it's the question how different factors interact with each other. And if I may, I would like to give 2 examples. In the first one, I would like to focus very much on wealth, or better said, the lack of it, because it's so closely tied to the other social characteristics that you mentioned. I already spoke about the different impacts that climate policy can have on women and men. And this is often connected to the fact that women tend to be poorer than men, in particular, certain groups of women. Take policy interventions that raise the price of energy to discourage people from using too much. In fact, of course, they look and sound sympathetic. But because women earn less than men and often work less or not at all to take care of their children, they end up with much lower pensions than men. And this is seen all over in the EU, almost 40% less in fact. This leads to a lot of older women in the EU living in poverty. And higher energy prices can make it difficult for them to heat their homes, for example. The same goes for single mothers and households where women are the main breadwinner. Mm-hmm. So the answer is not to hold off from raising energy prices. That's not what I'm saying. It's to look at who will lose out from policy action and to help them.
Yep. Yep.
So look at the real situation, take the needs of men and women into account when you design your policies, and be aware of the consequences of those policies.
Thank you very much. And Carleen, I would just say for those who are tweeting, hashtag EU GreenWeek 2021, I think that's a really good phrase there. Look at who will lose out. You need to look at, there's a lot of thinking required to unpack here. I'm going to come back to you because I know you like to talk concretely, get behind the definitions, Michael. We've talked about a lot of examples. I think we've painted a picture so people understand our starting point and the links between environmental and various precarious situations, vulnerable groups. So let's talk action. You are so experienced. You could wave a magic wand. You say to me, what actions can the EU take and member states take to really address this very specific issue?
Sure. Well, sadly, there's no magic wand. But I would like first to come back to what Patricia said, completely agreeing with her, about the need to focus attention on all of these groups and work with them to change their experience.
Yeah.
But we also have to work with ourselves. We have to tackle the racism in our societies, the tendency in the general population to exclude, to push to the margins. That's us. And so any effort for, let's say, Roma has also got to concentrate on the people who exclude Roma. So just in addition to the point that Patricia made.
OK, and let me just say, you're opposite somebody in a wine bar, a pub, a park, and you're opposite somebody who's, ooh, I don't like the other. So you say we have to address that. How would you do that in that personal situation?
Well, first we have to do what Patricia said. We have to name the fact that we've got a problem. We are racist societies, and we have to acknowledge that. I hear far too many politicians on lazy chat shows saying, well, racism may be a problem there or there or there, but not here. And the evidence defies that in every moment. Mm-hmm. So we have to tackle that. We've got to invest in education, in public awareness raising. We've got to empower the victims of racism to speak for themselves so that people recognise that we're talking here about people, human beings.
Yes.
We have to deal with this business of the different experiences of children, of older people, and so on. But let me come back to your suggestion for action.
Take your time, because they won't be able, because you're saying such valuable things and our lovely audience at home won't catch it. Go on.
But I come from the Fundamental Rights Agency, and I haven't mentioned rights yet. The European Union has formally, solemnly committed itself to deliver on human and fundamental rights. Yes. They're guaranteed in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That's a set of guarantees for people, not the wealthy people, not the rich people, not us. It's above all about the people on the edges. So we have the formal commitment. We've got to deliver on that. We also have to deliver on it in the Green Deal, in delivering this better environmental future. But we haven't drilled that down yet. We still have a long way to go to figure out what it would look like. Practically, what would it look like? It would mean doing fundamental rights impact assessment of any environmental projects. It would mean the EU getting better at holding back resources when there are issues of environmental degradation. It would mean turning to business, making it much easier for people to get justice when a business violates their rights. We researched this. We know it's there on paper, but it's very difficult to deliver. The courtrooms are expensive, it takes too long, it's too complicated, the burden of proof is the wrong way. Yeah. So these would be some very practical rollouts of putting human rights at the heart of the agenda.
Absolutely, and it's a bit like with health, it's a bit like preventive versus treatment. What you're saying is, Kat, we can't wait for the treatment end, the going to court. It's too expensive, it's too lengthy, it's just not accessible for most people. So we've got to get it right at the front end.
Yes.
So there's a lot of this, there's a lot of talk, there is, you mentioned there within policy there is that, but not enough on the one hand, and how do we make sure it's enforced? Now, you did there also touch upon businesses and accountability. So I'm going to come back to Matthias, if I may, just off the back of that. We've got about 15 minutes to just still chat amongst us. So, Matthias, responsibility. So you have this anchored. It's complicated for some businesses. They have a responsibility. What's your responsibility to encourage others in the value chain, businesses, but others, to follow suit, to pick up from your actions and to follow suit? And please do refer to anything that you've heard your fellow speakers say if you want to come back on anything at the same time. Thank you.
Yeah, so we just heard about human rights in business, and I think that's a big topic. The 16th of June of this year could be really a day for celebration, because 10 years ago, the Ruggie principles have been agreed by the United Nations. However, those principles anchoring human rights topics in value chains have not been brought to life in a decade. And I think we are running a bit out of time on that topic as well. In Germany, in a couple of days, there will be a supply chain law supported by the parliament. And I think that for the European Union, a supply chain law that codifies the Ruggie principles is a necessary step to bring to life what was agreed on with a lot of hope 10 years ago. So that's something I think where business also should support, because I believe those regulations increase the fairness between those who actually try to respect human rights and try also to give people access to remedy, and those who choose not to do that and often get off with it. I want to talk about one other topic when we talk about gender mainstreaming. When you look at smallholder farmers, who are usually the poorest people in the world, what we found is it's not necessarily only the access to inherited or own land, or the access to seeds, or the access to fertilizers that make the difference. It's often whether you focus your training and your support on women, because women are a backbone of smallholder farming around the world. And I want to address one topic that I feel we need to fix much faster than 2030, and that's the access to family planning. There are more than 220 million women around the world who don't have access to family planning. The leading technology is actually produced in Europe, in Finland, that would help to solve the problem. We have to close that access gap, because without it, all the other interventions will not transform the lives of those women who are smallholder farmers, and often basically hold back in their development because they can't do everything. They can't do everything in terms of running a farm and taking care of a growing family. And that's a reality we can address, and when we address it, pays off big time.
Thank you very much. And also, I think, I mean, another sector in which that is absolutely, we could say the same thing, women, very critical, is also fisheries, maritime fisheries. I mean, there is a lot of women there who are in support of their husbands, their partners going out, and they're, you know, mending the nets, they're doing the promotion. It's the exact same story I hear. So it's critical in so many different sectors. I'd like to make sure something that I haven't drilled into, Patricia, with you. You said, listen, Kat, you know, in the policy, this is not what I'm seeing. So how can we make sure that in the shaping of the policy, we make sure that that representation gap for minorities, you know, is addressed in the decision making at the start? It's a bit like Michael said, you know, we need to get it right. Not we can do something if it goes wrong, we need to make sure it goes right. So how can we get those voices? Give us concrete examples of how we could improve that.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Representation is key to make sure that we can include all these different experiences in the way we design policies together. We've heard some figures about the gender gap in representation, how, you know, only 30% of environment ministers are women, how only 35% of the delegates to the conference when the Paris Agreement was negotiated were women. So international climate negotiations are very, you know, gender biased in a way. So if we shift the focus a bit on Europeans who come from ethnic minorities, racialized communities, about 10% of Europeans. These people, we've heard it now all over, are often more impacted by pollution, degradation, climate change, and even the policies that we put in place, and yet we hardly see them in environmental policy making. So, for instance, if we look at whether that's the experts in governments, in the European Commission, whether that's in parliaments, so of course there's a responsibility with institutions, with political parties to take measures to increase the number of people with these different experiences within these different institutions. So of course there's a lot of different measures that one can take. And again, to use the phrase again, intersectionality is really important, because we do see, of course, that women who also have other marginalizing factors, whether that's coming from a low socioeconomic background or being a woman of color, of course leads to even less representation. That's something we really have to keep in mind. And a bit of self-criticism as well. I mean, we as civil society, we're also trying to find solutions how we can increase full representation within our own organizations and make sure that we include these experiences in our campaigns and our advocacy advocacy work. So again, there's no magic wand and not no one solution that fits all, but again, it starts with that acknowledgement that we cannot reach our sustainability objectives if we don't co-design these policies with the communities that are most affected. So let's ask ourselves questions like, when the European Green Deal was designed, when all these strategies and new laws are being built, have we consulted Roma communities on these issues? Or are they only being consulted when we talk about sector-specific Roma inclusion policies? Are we really talking to those people who are breathing the toxic air? Are we talking to those people who settle next to the waste landfills when we find solutions? So the first step is really to acknowledge that we have a gender, a whiteness and a class problem in how we design policies, and that is most relevant to the policies that we're designing now to achieve sustainability.
Let me just ask you, before I come on to Carleen and to you, Michael, and also, I mean, for me, it's not just how do we ensure it, but also how do you surely give people the space? Because we say include the people so they don't feel, I talked agency at the beginning, they don't feel like beneficiaries or it's foisted, but not everybody feels qualified in themselves as people. So part of it, isn't it, is surely tricky in the policy-making aspect to give people that reassurance and that space that they can be a part of that, because they might think, oh no, I don't want to say that. They don't have the time, they don't feel... Is that something that you would resonates with you?
I'm thinking as we talk about how we've committed the sin ourselves with this panel. We may have a good gender balance, but that's it. We're all white. We're not representative of the minority groups that we're speaking about. And I'm not saying that to criticize our hosts. I'm saying it to demonstrate how difficult it is to make that shift. It requires a proactive thinking about making sure there's a representation. And in terms of people not feeling able, let's avoid being condescending. Let's invite.
Can I just qualify? I didn't mean to be condescending. No. Because just to say, in other areas, you have discussions, particularly around research and innovation, and particular discussions on some of the programs in the EU where you find out you have to come up with a plethora of opportunities to make people feel. I'm not saying that they are not. It was not meant in a condescending way.
I appreciate the point. But, you know, civil society is thriving. It's thousands of organizations. Every community we're speaking about today is in some sense represented by good, smart, clever voices of civil society with whom we need to engage. And that requires proactive participatory approaches across everything we're doing, every stage of every policy. May I add another point, by the way?
Yes.
And that is that beyond listening to people, we need data. We're weak on that. We're weak on measuring the impact of environmental degradation and pollution on groups on the edges of our societies. Very few governments are gathering this information. I don't see a huge investment in it yet in the European Union.
But is it not being gathered because it's, again, an issue of awareness? We don't know that we need to be specifically gathering data?
I'm not so sure, but we do need it. I mean, we're having this panel to recognise that there's a set of complex problems that have to be addressed. Now, probably one of the reasons we're not gathering the data is not because we don't think we need it. It's because we don't think we're able to do it.
Okay.
There's a perception out there that it's very difficult to gather data from groups on the edges of society. It is challenging, but we at the Fundamental Rights Agency have been doing it for years. The key is we don't gather data about Roma, about migrants. We gather data with them. About themselves. Sure. And so you can build up trust, you can invest in the liaison and in the dispelling of all the fears, but it takes time, effort and investment, again, in working with the impacted communities.
Absolutely, but it takes care. It takes care. Can I just use that word? It takes giving a shit. So there we go. I mean, that's the way I phrase it. That's what it is. Absolutely really caring. Thank you. I was going to come to you about data, and I do know that one of the reasons that we have got this session here is precisely because this is an issue that isn't obvious. It is a bit tricky. There isn't a large awareness, and the EU, I think, is actually crying out for data. So brilliant that you put your finger on it right there. In the few minutes, we've got about 8 before I'm going to invite back our representative from the Commission to do a sort of a little bit of a Q&A. I'd like to come to Carleen again, if I may, just bring in the Sustainable Development Goals. They are an important framework. They do need to be localised. They recognise that ending poverty has to go hand in hand with strategies that build economic growth, fair economic growth, and address all sorts of social needs and take into account climate change and environmental protection. If you had to propose one key action to make sure that structures, organisational structures, policies, practices are more gender responsive, what would you propose?
Well, Katrina, I think it has been said already. It would be gender mainstreaming. And I know that for many this is a difficult term, but actually it means that whenever you design a policy, whenever you design a project, whenever you work on legislation, you need to take the situation of women and men into account. And this starts with a solid gender analysis. And for that one, indeed, we need data. And I think that in many cases, there's no awareness of the fact that gender is an issue in all policy areas. And that's why I think that often data are not being collected. If we have the gender analysis, we should do a solid gender impact assessment, because even if you have the data, you should still ask yourself, when I'm going to design the policies the way I want, what will be the impact on men and women? And for that, a gender impact assessment is really relevant. And if you see that the policies are going to impact men and women in such a way that they create inequality or further enforce inequality between women and men, you should amend. You should change those policies.
But Carleen, can I just ask also a question? And again, it's when I was chatting with the Commission before this panel. How do you, amongst some people, stop, oh, you know, it's that women thing again. Oh, God, yeah, we've heard it. You know, how do you prevent some of that thinking? Because let's be frank, there is also that thinking going on, and that's just with gender, let alone other issues we're talking about here.
Yes, and you know, I have worked in different environments. I worked in national government. I worked with the Council of Europe, and in the Council of Europe, for example, they deal with many different portfolios. They go from education to combating terrorism. And how I actually convinced my colleagues in the Council of Europe that gender is a relevant issue is that I made them aware of the fact that if they kept that blind spot on the situation of women and men, they simply wouldn't create the best policies. For example, terrorism, they were not aware of the fact that many women were also perpetrators. They were active in terrorism, and not only victims. So what I'm saying here, if you don't do a solid assessment, a gender analysis and an impact assessment, you simply miss the boat. And I'm sure that all governments and also the Commission, they want to develop the best policies that will help citizens in Europe. And for that, you simply cannot ignore the fact that you should look into the situation of women and men on the ground.
Okay.
It's not a women's issue per se, it's equality between women and men. And we can't afford that whenever we design policies, they would create inequalities between women and men. That's not acceptable.
Absolutely. And again, another, I think, so important what you said there, and I hope everyone picked that up at home. It's not a women's issue per se, it's women and men. I think I can see you nodding there, Michael. Did you want to just come in there?
Yeah, I think it's not that society is jaded, that policymakers are fed up with these issues. It's that we maybe need to do a much better job of communicating our messages. Take the general public. We know it from our survey work. The general public in Europe is pretty decent and fair. Most people, the vast majority of people, want human rights respected in their societies. So the basis is there for the cooperation. But we have to put a face on the problem. We have to communicate the concern, propose pathways to a solution. And if we do that in a clever, smart way, then we really will make progress with our societies.
Thank you. I think you do say something important there, and I'm glad that you do say it. Come on, we see, you know, the majority are decent people who want to do what's right, what's best, what's caring. Just for balance sake, and I will come to you in just a moment, Patricia, if there is a last word. Matthias, either a last word from something you've heard that resonates from your perspective, or if there's anything you wanted to add on the importance of data, because I know it is critical and it does get us from the raising awareness stage to the really hammering home the taking action stage. You need it to underpin it, but what would you like to say as a last word here?
When we look at, for example, the gender balance in leadership at Bayer, we did the math, and you can simply, in the Bayer case, if you were only to offer half of the leadership positions that will get vacated between now and the end of the decade to women, you basically would reach gender parity. Right. And what I mean with that is we can talk a lot about convincing and trying to make the argument for it. We need to create the rules, the conditions that make it mandatory. And the only way for us at Bayer to achieve this goal of gender parity in leadership was through setting a clear target and then changing the conditions which make it possible to reach the target. Because the workplace looks different, but to be honest, in a very good way, because the more you have gender as well as generational and geographic diversity in your leadership teams, the better the decisions are. For me, the main argument for gender mainstreaming or for inclusion and diversity is you actually make better decisions in leadership teams that are more diverse.
Thank you.
You make more money, you are economically more successful, and you are more likely to achieve goals like the global goals on sustainable development. It's not just about justice, it's also about effectiveness. Yeah,
and absolutely, a very, very good point there. You spoke about making better policies. You want to make the best policies. You want to make good business in the right way there. That's also what it's about, not just about fairness. Literally, 2 sentences before I invite Elizabeth Werner to join us for the end, what you didn't get to say or what you would like the audience to take as a takeaway. 3 sentences from you, from everybody, and I will come to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Carleen said a very important thing, that what we need to communicate much better is this is not just about gender, it's really about designing environmental and sustainability policies that are better for everyone, that have a better impact on the environment as well. So we want environmental policies that deliver on a healthy planet and on a healthy society. And I think this is something that we need to communicate much better, that if we take these different experiences and these different situations into account, that the policies ultimately become better for both nature and people.
Thank you. Michael, what did you not get to say, or what do you want to reinforce?
Right behind you, there's the title of the session. It says, Environmental Sustainability and Equality, Dilemma or Opportunity. I would throw out the words dilemma or opportunity, and I'd substitute the word duty.
Duty. Thank you very much. Can I come to you, Matthias? Last couple of sentences, something you didn't get to say or you want to reinforce? 2 words.
The 2 words are, I take one chemical formula, H2O. We need to focus more on the topic of water. I believe everything around water will just aggravate the conversation we had today. And I feel it's like with the pandemic, we talk about a lot of things, but access to water is one we tend to not focus as much about as the topic deserves.
Thank you. Carleen, very last word from you before I turn to Elizabeth.
Yes, Katrina. Well, I would like to stress again that gender mainstreaming it's key. It's not a burden, it's a certain way of thinking. And gender mainstreaming is key to develop the best policies, the best projects, and the best legislation that do justice to all citizens in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. You have all been so clear. There is so much to think about. Don't go away. Just stay with me, because in the last closing twilight 5 minutes, Elizabeth, I'm sorry I've eaten a bit into your time, but if I can welcome the Deputy Secretary-General for Policy Coordination and the head of the Equality Task Force for the European Commission, if you're there. Now, I'm going to ask you to be brief in your answers. I'm sorry, we've got so much there. But first one, very obviously, we heard the European Green Deal. We've got this pathway to 2050. The EU is committed to being a union of equality. We heard there from Patricia right at the start, OK, I know that, but I'm not seeing enough of it in the policy. So how can we be sure that we do?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I hope many people have listened here. I want to be very clear on this to avoid any misunderstanding. Leaving no one behind is one of the central elements of our green transformation. And there is no question really of choosing between making the EU greener on one side and making the EU more equal and inclusive on the other side. These two things, they go together, and we have heard a number of examples that show this. I also, like others, try to find concrete examples, and some of them overlap, but let me nevertheless, in the wrapping up, come back to them. When you consider gender, the example of transport is the most compelling. Women have the lower carbon footprint. When you look at cars and transport, women drive smaller cars, they use more public transport, they pay more attention to the environmental impacts of their actions. But you also look, please, at accessibility. Certain products and certain services for persons with disabilities, with reduced mobility, for older persons. We're going into a renovation wave here, that allows us to make buildings not only more energy efficient, but also a unique opportunity to improve the accessibility. Look at the vulnerable citizens, the minorities. Pollution, as was said right at the beginning, has more harmful impacts on human health, and they are borne more by the most vulnerable groups. And this is where the Zero Pollution Action Plan is very, very clear, that this is also a fight not only for reducing pollution, but for more fairness and more equality. And I won't repeat the very telling example of Roma people, but I think that has come across very well. And we know there is a climate change gap. And this is why when we come to the Green Deal and now to our implementation place, we need that this continues to be carried by everyone in the population. There is a large support, but we should be clear, it's not only an opportunity, it has not only benefits, it will have costs as well. And we're doing this against the background of the economic downturn resulting from the COVID. And we need to be very clear that in all our strategies, in all our legislation, but most of all also in our spending, in the EU funding, the just transition, the cushioning of the effects has to be very central. And I can tell you that energy poverty is very high on my agenda as we now work on preparing the Fit for 55 package.
Thank you. Thank you. And sorry that I came in there. I'm so aware of the timing. But you know what I do appreciate, and I think it's important that you did put that focus on cost. It's not what we didn't focus on that in the discussion. I think it is important, and again, to reiterate that against the backdrop of COVID, and important to see where the EU recovery funds can also be really key in terms of addressing this issue. I'm going to group my last two questions because it's 10:59 together and I can only go over 1 or 2 minutes. Two things we spoke about: intersectionality equality mainstreaming. They came up in these discussions. So over to the EU, how do we make sure that pre-existing inequalities in all sorts of different settings are addressed as part of this green transition, and that we really do keep this equality dimension in mind throughout?
Yeah, let me pick up again on these economic aspects, because it was mentioned that doing our policy in a way that cares about equality makes it also a better policy making. But once again, what these two policies, equality and the Green Deal, have in common is that the costs of not doing it are really by much bigger than you cannot avoid doing it. Not reducing pollution, not reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not preserving biodiversity, and not doing it in a society that is more just and more equal is simply something we cannot afford. So we have to do it. And we have in the Commission set up governance to do that. And this is where the mainstreaming comes in. Not only do we have commissioners specifically in charge of each of these topics, and all the decision making is collegial, we have also at the more administrative level set up the task force on equality, which I'm chairing, where we discuss with extremely enthusiastic colleagues who have the best possible access to information and data, every single policy to mainstream.
Elizabeth, I have been given clear instructions here by the technicians that I need to wind this up because I don't want us to get cut off. But I do apologise that I couldn't give you the whole time, but I do hear what you're saying, and even in what you've said there, it is very, very clear the different mechanisms and the different thinking at the Commission. So I'm going to have to close now. Forgive me. I do thank you very, very much for listening in. I know you had more to say. I thank Joanna Drake. I thank Michael, Carleen, Matthias, Patricia. You have all been splendid. I think we can go away from this at least knowing clearly what the topic is about, to help to raise that awareness, to understand the ways. It is a duty, as Michael said, but it is about making a better society as a whole and better policies, and that's at the heart of all of this. Thank you very much for listening in, ladies and gentlemen. Have a brilliant rest of the day at GreenWeek. Wish you.